Your council tax bill could be about to change, and not in the way you might hope. Behind closed doors, government officials are quietly discussing something that hasn't happened in over 30 years: a complete revaluation of every home in England. We're not talking about minor adjustments or tweaks to the system. This is a fundamental reassessment that could see millions of households facing dramatically different bills. The question isn't if it will happen anymore, it's when and how much it will cost you. Right now, your council tax is based on what your property was worth back in 1991. Think about that for a moment. The year Freddie Mercury passed away, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the average house price in the UK was just over £50,000. That's the system still determining your bill today. But smash that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter, because what's coming next will affect every homeowner in the country, and you need to stay ahead of these changes. The system we're all stuck with is beyond outdated. Properties across England are still valued according to 1991 prices, frozen in time like some bizarre economic time capsule. A modest terraced house in what's now a trendy London neighbourhood might still be in a low band because back then the area was considered rough. Meanwhile, a large detached home in a northern town that's seen economic decline could be in a higher band, despite its current value being relatively modest. The imbalance has become impossible to ignore. Some homeowners are paying far less than they should based on their property's actual worth, while others are shouldering an unfair burden. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has called it one of the most regressive taxes in the country, and they're not known for dramatic statements. Labour's leadership has been dancing around this issue for months now, dropping hints but never quite committing. Behind the reassuring public statements about protecting working families, there's been a flurry of activity that tells a different story. Treasury documents leaked earlier this year revealed that officials have been running detailed models on what a revaluation would look like. They've analysed the political fallout, calculated the winners and losers, and mapped out implementation strategies. This isn't speculation or distant planning. This is serious preparation for something they intend to make happen. Multiple government sources have confirmed that revaluation is being actively considered as part of broader fiscal reforms. The timing is particularly interesting given the massive hole in public finances that everyone keeps talking about. Local councils are desperate for more funding, and a revaluation offers a way to generate significant additional revenue without technically creating a new tax. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable for millions of homeowners. If your property has increased in value more than the average since 1991, you're likely looking at a higher council tax bill. Properties in the southeast, particularly around London, have seen astronomical growth. A house worth £80,000 in 1991 might now be valued at over £500,000. Under a revaluation, that property could easily jump 2 or 3 bands higher. We're not talking about an extra £20 or £30 a year either. Band increases can mean hundreds or even thousands added to your annual bill. The Resolution Foundation has estimated that around 4 million households could see increases, with those in expensive areas hit hardest. But there's another twist that makes this even more concerning. The bands themselves could be restructured. The current system has 8 bands from A to H, but there's nothing stopping the government from adding new bands at the top end. Properties worth several million could find themselves in a new superband with eye-watering rates. This isn't just speculation, it's exactly what happened in Wales when they revalued in 2005. They added a band I for the most expensive properties, and Scotland did something similar. England is the last holdout, and that makes it ripe for the most dramatic changes. Wealthy homeowners in areas like Kensington, Chelsea and Surrey should be particularly worried. The political optics of making millionaires pay more council tax are simply too tempting for any government looking to appear fair while raising revenue. Some analysts are predicting that top-band properties could see their bills double or even triple under a new system. What makes this situation even more troubling is the complete lack of transparency around the process. The Valuation Office Agency, the body that would carry out this massive undertaking, has been quietly hiring additional staff and upgrading its systems. Freedom of Information requests have revealed that they've been conducting test valuations in select areas, running pilot programs that most residents don't even know about. The government insists this is just routine modernisation, but the timing is hardly coincidental. These preparations take years to put in place, which means plans for revaluation have been in motion far longer than politicians have been willing to admit publicly. The infrastructure is being built right now for a system that could fundamentally change how much you pay to live in your own home. The political calculation behind all of this is brutally simple. A revaluation will create winners and losers, and the government is betting that they can manage the fallout. Properties that have declined in relative value or haven't kept pace with regional growth could actually see their bills decrease. Northern constituencies and less affluent areas might benefit, while wealthy southern regions shoulder more of the burden. From a vote counting perspective, this makes sense. There are more households in lower value properties than in expensive ones. If the government can position this as making the wealthy pay their fair share while offering relief to struggling families, they might be able to weather the inevitable backlash. But political calculations have a nasty habit of colliding with reality in unexpected ways. What seems fair in a spreadsheet can feel deeply unjust to the family who saved for decades to buy their home, only to be penalised because property values in their area rose faster than elsewhere. The mechanics of how this would actually work should concern everyone paying attention. Once a revaluation is announced, there would likely be a snapshot date when property values are assessed. Everything you've done to improve your home, every extension, every renovation, every upgrade suddenly becomes part of the calculation for your new council tax band. That loft conversion you added to create space for a growing family could bump you up a band. The kitchen renovation that made your mornings more bearable becomes a liability on your annual tax bill. Even factors beyond your control, like new transport links or improved schools in your area, would work against you. Your home's value increased, so your tax burden increases, regardless of whether you have any more money to pay it. There's also the question of how quickly this could happen. Past revaluations have been announced with relatively short notice, giving homeowners little time to prepare or plan. The Welsh revaluation took about 2 years from announcement to implementation, but that was for a much smaller housing stock. England has over 24 million properties that would need to be assessed. The logistical challenge is immense, but so is the political will when governments need money. Some experts are suggesting we could see an announcement as early as next year's budget, with implementation phased in over the following years. Others think it might be delayed until after the next election, used as a manifesto commitment to avoid the immediate political damage. Either way, the consensus among those watching closely is that it's not a question of if, but when. What's particularly galling for many homeowners is the lack of democratic input into this process. You don't get to vote on whether your property is revalued or which band it falls into. The Valuation Office Agency makes that decision, and while there's an appeals process, it's notoriously difficult to navigate and win. You're essentially at the mercy of a bureaucratic assessment based on algorithms and comparable properties, with little room to argue about your individual circumstances. Your bills could increase substantially, and your only real option is to accept it or spend months fighting through an appeals system stacked against you. This isn't how most people think taxation should work in a democracy, but it's the reality of the council tax system we've inherited. For those living in areas that have seen rapid gentrification, the implications are particularly harsh. You might have bought your home decades ago when the neighbourhood was affordable and rough around the edges. You've watched it transform, seen new restaurants and shops open, witnessed house prices climb as wealthier newcomers moved in. Now you face being priced out not by the market but by the tax system. Your property value has increased on paper, but you're still the same person with the same income, trying to live in the same home. A revaluation doesn't care about your personal story or financial situation. It only cares about what your property is theoretically worth on the open market. This is how long-time residents get pushed out of neighbourhoods they helped build and sustain. The rental market adds another layer of complexity that hardly anyone is discussing. Landlords facing higher council tax bills will simply pass those costs on to tenants through increased rents. It's inevitable economics. If a landlord's costs go up, they don't absorb that loss out of generosity. They raise the rent at the next opportunity. Tenants who don't even own property will end up paying for a revaluation designed to make homeowners pay their fair share. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so predictable. Renters already struggling with affordability in expensive areas will face even higher housing costs, all because the property they're renting happens to have increased in value. They see none of the benefit of that increased equity, but they'll certainly feel the financial pain of higher taxes on it. Some government advisors have outed the idea of protection mechanisms for vulnerable homeowners, perhaps freezing increases for pensioners or low-income families. These sound compassionate on the surface, but they introduce massive complexity into an already complicated system. How do you means test council tax fairly without creating perverse incentives or bureaucratic nightmares? What happens when someone's circumstances change and they no longer qualify for protection? The administrative burden alone could eat up a significant portion of any additional revenue raised. More importantly, these protections often end up being inadequate when they're actually implemented. The thresholds are set too low, the eligibility criteria too strict, and thousands who genuinely need help fall through the cracks. Good intentions in policy documents have a frustrating habit of becoming something far less helpful in practice. The comparison with business rates makes this whole situation even more frustrating. Commercial properties face regular revaluations every few years, keeping their tax burden aligned with current market conditions. Businesses have been screaming about the unfairness of this for years, watching their rates climb while residential council tax remains frozen in the early 90s. Now homeowners might face a catch-up revaluation that makes up for 3 decades of inaction all at once. Instead of gradual adjustments that people could plan for and absorb, we're potentially looking at a massive one-time shock to the system. It's terrible policy design driven by political cowardice. Previous governments have kicked this can down the road for so long that any solution now will inevitably be painful for millions of people. There's also the environmental angle that's starting to creep into discussions around property taxation. Some policymakers are arguing that larger homes with bigger carbon footprints should pay more, using the tax system to encourage sustainable living. A revaluation could incorporate these environmental considerations, penalising homes with poor energy efficiency or large floor spaces. Your Edwardian house with original windows and high ceilings might be charming and full of character, but it could also be deemed environmentally inefficient and taxed accordingly. This adds yet another dimension to an already complex situation, where your tax bill becomes tied not just to your property's value, but to subjective assessments of its environmental impact. The potential for this to be manipulated or applied unfairly is enormous. What almost nobody is talking about is the appeals avalanche that will inevitably follow any revaluation. When Wales revalued their properties, they were swamped with challenges and disputes that took years to resolve. Homeowners who felt their properties had been unfairly assessed flooded the system with appeals, creating a massive backlog. England has roughly 15 times as many properties as Wales. Scale that appeals process up accordingly, and you're looking at potential chaos lasting well into the next decade. The Valuation Office Agency is already stretched thin dealing with current workloads. Adding millions of revaluation appeals on top would require massive investment in staff, systems, and resources. That's money that has to come from somewhere, likely from the very tax revenue the revaluation is supposed to generate. The technology involved in modern property valuation is both impressive and slightly terrifying. Automated valuation models use artificial intelligence and machine learning to assess properties based on comparable sales, location data, and property characteristics. These systems can process millions of properties quickly, but they also make mistakes and struggle with unique situations. Your home isn't just data points in an algorithm. It has quirks and features that might not be captured accurately by automated systems. Maybe your house backs onto a noisy railway line that significantly impacts its value, or perhaps you have a structural issue that's expensive to fix. These nuances often get lost when computers are making bulk assessments. You could end up in a higher band than you deserve simply because an algorithm didn't account for factors that would be obvious to a human assessor actually visiting your property. International comparisons offer some insight into how badly this could go or how well it might work depending on your perspective. In Ireland, Property taxes were introduced based on self-assessment, where homeowners declared their own property's value within specified bands. The system was widely criticised for being open to abuse, with people predictably undervaluing their homes. Other countries like Denmark have sophisticated systems that continuously adjust property taxes based on rolling valuations. These work reasonably well, but require significant administrative infrastructure and political will to maintain. The question for England is which model we'll end up with and whether the government has the competence to implement it properly. Recent track records with large-scale government IT projects and policy implementations don't inspire tremendous confidence. For those planning to buy property in the near future, this creates a bizarre dilemma. Do you factor in potential council tax increases when deciding what you can afford? Should you avoid areas where property values have risen sharply because they're more likely to see band increases? These aren't questions buyers have traditionally had to worry about, but they're becoming relevant considerations. Estate agents are starting to mention potential revaluation impacts when discussing properties with clients, though most are downplaying the risks because they don't want to scare off buyers. The uncertainty alone is enough to make some people reconsider their plans or look at different areas than they originally intended. When you can't reliably predict your future housing costs beyond your mortgage, making long-term financial plans becomes significantly harder. The issue of second homes and holiday properties adds another contentious dimension. Many coastal and rural communities have been hollowed out by wealthy buyers purchasing properties they only occupy a few weeks per year. A revaluation could be combined with additional premiums for second homes, using the tax system to discourage this practice. Some councils are already implementing 100% premiums on empty properties, doubling the council tax for homes left vacant. Extending this to a revalued system could make owning a second home significantly more expensive, potentially forcing some owners to sell. While this might help local residents afford homes in their own communities, it would also represent a major shift in how property ownership is taxed. The wealthy rarely accept new tax burdens quietly, and the political pressure from second homeowners could be intense. There's something deeply uncomfortable about a tax system that penalises you for living in an area that becomes more desirable. You didn't choose for your neighbourhood to become trendy or for nearby infrastructure to improve. You might have been there long before the organic cafes and vintage boutiques arrived. Yet, under a revalued system, you pay more simply because other people decided your area was worth investing in. This feels fundamentally unjust to many long-time residents who see themselves being pushed out by forces entirely beyond their control. It's a form of taxation that doesn't consider your ability to pay, only the theoretical value of an asset you might have no intention of ever selling. You could be asset-rich but cash-poor, living in a valuable property while struggling to cover basic expenses, and the system wouldn't care. The political timing of when this gets announced will tell you everything you need to know about the government's confidence level. If it comes early in a parliamentary term, that suggests they want to get the pain over with and hope voters forget by the next election. If it's delayed until later, or buried in a budget full of other announcements, that indicates they're trying to minimise the political fallout. Either way, the decision has almost certainly already been made in principle at the highest levels of government. What's happening now is working out the details and crafting the messaging to make it as palatable as possible. Don't be fooled by ministers saying they have no plans for revaluation. That's political speak for "we're absolutely doing this, but we're not ready to announce it yet." Local councils themselves are split on whether revaluation is good news for them. Those representing areas with high property value growth stand to gain significantly more revenue, which they desperately need for services. But councils in areas that haven't seen much growth or have actually declined might end up worse off if their residents move to lower bands. The redistribution of council tax revenue across different regions could be substantial, creating new winners and losers at the local authority level. This adds a layer of political complexity because councils that benefit will lobby hard for revaluation, while those that lose out will fight against it. The government will have to navigate these competing interests while also trying to sell the policy to the public as fair and necessary. Consumer debt is already at concerning levels across the UK. and adding unexpected council tax increases into the mix could push some households over the edge. People budget based on their current commitments, and a sudden increase of several £100s a year isn't trivial for families already stretched thin. Payment plans and support mechanisms might be offered, but those often come with their own complications and stress. For some people, a significant council tax increase could be the difference between managing financially and falling into arrears on multiple commitments. The social impact of revaluation could extend far beyond just annoying homeowners. It could contribute to genuine financial hardship for vulnerable households who happen to live in properties that have appreciated significantly. The data privacy implications of revaluation are getting almost no attention, but they should concern anyone who values their privacy. Conducting accurate property valuations requires detailed information about your home, its size, its feet, yours, its condition. That information gets collected, stored, and analysed by government agencies. In an era of data breaches and surveillance concerns, creating a massive centralised database of detailed property information presents obvious risks. Who has access to this data? How is it protected? What stops it being used for purposes beyond council tax assessment? These questions rarely get satisfying answers from government officials who are more focused on the revenue potential than the privacy implications. Your home is your castle, supposedly, but the government will know an awful lot about that castle once revaluation is complete. The rental market distortions created by differential council tax rates are already significant and would only get worse. In some areas, council tax on a one-bedroom flat might be relatively low because the property is in Band A. In a nearby neighbourhood, an identical flat could be Band C simply because of location. After revaluation, these discrepancies might be corrected, but they could also be amplified. Renters looking for affordable housing have to consider council tax as part of their total housing cost, and these variations can make a significant difference to where they can afford to live. The complexity and unpredictability make housing decisions harder than they need to be, adding stress to a process that's already challenging enough for people trying to find somewhere decent to live. One aspect that's almost certain to cause controversy is how quickly property improvements will be reassessed going forward. Currently, if you extend or significantly improve your property, you're supposed to notify the valuation office and your band might be adjusted. In practice, many people don't bother because enforcement is lax and the chances of being caught are low. After a full revaluation, there will likely be increased scrutiny and enforcement. Planning permission records will be cross-referenced with council tax bands and discrepancies will be investigated. That conservatory or loft conversion you added years ago without updating your council tax record could suddenly come back to haunt you with backdated bills and penalties. The incentive to report improvements honestly depends on people trusting the system to be fair, and that trust is in short supply. Scotland and Wales offer working examples of how revaluation plays out in practice, and the lessons aren't entirely reassuring. Both countries saw significant protests and political fallout when their revaluations were implemented. The SNP faced anger from homeowners in Edinburgh and Glasgow who saw big increases. Welsh Labour dealt with similar backlash in Cardiff and Swansea. In both cases, the governments eventually had to introduce transitional relief schemes to ease the pain, which undermined the whole point of accurate revaluation. If you're going to revalue properties to make the system fair, but then introduce mechanisms to protect people from the consequences of that revaluation, you end up with a complicated mess that satisfies nobody. England is likely to follow a similar path, with grand plans for fairness giving way to messy political compromises when voters start complaining. The market distortion potential is something economists worry about, but most homeowners don't consider until it's too late. If certain areas become known as council tax hotspots where revaluation will hit hardest, that could affect property values and buyer interest. Why pay a premium to live somewhere if you know your council tax bill is going to be punitive? Conversely, areas expected to see decreases might become more attractive, driving up prices and creating new affordability issues. The property market is already complicated enough without adding tax revaluation speculation into buyer calculations. Estate agents will inevitably start marketing properties, partly based on their expected post-revaluation council tax position, adding another variable to an already complex purchasing decision. The fundamental question nobody in government wants to answer honestly is whether this is about fairness or revenue. If it's genuinely about making the system fairer by aligning tax bands with current property values, then you'd expect the changes to be revenue neutral overall, with increases in some areas offset by decreases in others. But the government's fiscal situation makes it pretty clear this is primarily about raising more money. Local councils are desperate for funding, and central government doesn't want to give it to them directly because that would require raising taxes or cutting services elsewhere. A revaluation offers political cover for what's essentially a tax increase, dressed up in the language of fairness and modernisation. It allows politicians to claim they're fixing an outdated system while conveniently generating billions in additional revenue. Your ability to challenge your council tax band after revaluation will technically exist, but will be practically limited. The appeals process requires you to demonstrate that your property has been valued incorrectly compared to similar properties in your area. You can't appeal simply because you think the overall level of council tax is too high, or because you can't afford the increase. The grounds for appeal are narrow and technical, requiring evidence and often professional help to argue effectively. Most people don't have the time, knowledge, or resources to mount an effective challenge. They end up accepting whatever band they're assigned, even if it feels wrong, because fighting it seems like more trouble than it's worth. This is exactly what governments count on when implementing controversial policies, that most people will grumble, but ultimately comply because the alternative is too difficult. The intergenerational fairness arguments around revaluation cut both ways depending on your perspective. Younger people struggling to get on the property ladder might see revaluation as appropriate, arguing that older homeowners who've benefited from decades of property value growth should pay more. But those older homeowners often live on fixed incomes, having planned their retirement finances around predictable housing costs. Hitting them with significant council tax increases could force some to sell homes they've lived in for decades, hardly a fair outcome for people who played by the rules and planned responsibly. There's no easy answer that satisfies both perspectives, which is why politicians have avoided this issue for so long. Any decision will anger substantial portions of the population, making it politically toxic no matter how it's handled. The commercial opportunities created by revaluation shouldn't be overlooked either. A whole industry of consultants, advisors, and legal experts will emerge to help homeowners navigate the system and challenge their assessments. Some will be legitimate professionals providing valuable SE services. Others will be opportunistic operators charging vulnerable people for help they don't really need. We've seen this pattern with every major change to housing policy or taxation. People's anxiety and confusion create a market for anyone claiming to have expertise or insider knowledge. You'll see advertisements promising to get your council tax band reduced, websites offering to check if you're overpaying, and companies selling revaluation insurance or protection services. Some of this will be helpful, much of it will be expensive and unnecessary, but it will all add to the general sense of chaos and uncertainty surrounding the whole process. International property investors and wealthy foreign buyers add yet another complication that domestic politics often ignores. London property in particular has long attracted overseas money looking for safe assets in a stable country. These buyers often don't live in the properties they own and aren't particularly sensitive to council tax levels that are modest compared to property taxes in many other countries. A revaluation that significantly increases taxes on high-value London properties might not deter these buyers at all, meaning the intended effect of making wealthy property owners pay more could be entirely absorbed by people who barely notice the increase. Meanwhile, domestic buyers and long-time residents face being priced out of their own city by a combination of high property prices and now high property taxes. The global nature of top-end property markets means that UK tax policy alone can't address the underlying affordability and inequality issues. The environmental sustainability angle deserves more attention than it's getting in current discussions. Property taxation could be restructured to incentivise energy efficiency and penalise wasteful housing stock. Homes with poor insulation, Inefficient heating systems or excessive floor space per occupant could face higher rates, while efficient homes get preferential treatment. This would align property taxation with climate goals and potentially drive improvements in housing quality, but it would also add enormous complexity to an already complicated system and create new grounds for dispute. How do you fairly assess energy efficiency across millions of properties built in different eras with different standards? Who pays for the assessments? And what happens when people can't afford the improvements needed to avoid higher taxes? These practical questions often derail well-intentioned environmental policies. The mental toll of financial uncertainty shouldn't be underestimated in all of this. Homeowners already deal with mortgage rate anxiety, maintenance costs, and general economic uncertainty. Adding the prospect of significant council tax increases creates another source of stress that affects well-being and life planning. Can you afford to stay in your home long-term? Should you downsize preemptively? What happens if you're hit with an increase you didn't budget for? These worries keep people up at night and influence major life decisions. The government's refusal to be transparent about revaluation plans just makes this anxiety worse, leaving millions of people in limbo wondering what's coming. Clear communication and adequate notice would at least allow people to prepare, but that would also give opposition time to organise, which is precisely why governments prefer to announce these things with minimal warning. What we're re-witnessing is the slow-motion collapse of a tax system that was never designed to last this long without reform. Council tax was introduced in 1993 as a replacement for the deeply unpopular poll tax, intended as a property-based system that roughly corresponded to ability to pay. The bands were set based on 1991 values with the assumption that regular revaluations would keep them aligned with the market. But the political pain of revaluation proved too much for successive governments to face, so they simply didn't do it. Now we're stuck with a system so divorced from reality that reform is both essential and incredibly painful. This is what happens when politicians prioritise short-term political survival over long-term policy coherence. The can gets kicked down the road until eventually there's nowhere left to kick it, and whoever is in power when that moment arrives has to deal with the accumulated consequences of decades of avoidance. The reality facing homeowners across England is that change is coming whether they're ready for it or not. The current system is unsustainable politically and practically, and governments of all stripes know it needs reform. A revaluation will happen, probably sooner than most people expect, and it will create winners and losers on a massive scale. Your postcode and property type will determine whether you're celebrating or suffering, and there's very little you can do to influence the outcome. What you can do is stay informed, understand what's being proposed, and plan as best you can for different scenarios. Ignoring this won't make it go away. It'll just mean you're caught unprepared when the announcement finally comes. The signs are all there for anyone paying attention. The question is whether enough people are watching to demand the transparency and fairness they deserve from a process that will affect every household in the country.